Hello and a very warm welcome from the Austrian KulturCafé, our new online platform for everything culture in Austria, Ukraine and beyond. We are starting this new show with a guest whose work is highly relevant for the creative sector in Ukraine. He's the head of the EU program House of Europe that was launched last year. But even before he assumed his current position, he spent years researching and publishing about Ukraine. Kristіан, Dімер, welcome to the Austrian KulturCafé.
Good evening, Ulf Hausbrand.
Kristіan, House of Europe was launched last year, but your relationship with Ukraine actually goes back much further. How did you discover Ukraine?
Yeah, that's indeed true. The story of me and Ukraine is longer than the story of me and House of Europe. I studied musicology and composition, and at the very early stage of my studies, it was a expedition that led me for the first time into Ukraine, related to culture history back then, actually. And I fell in love with the country. And then, as things would go, I decided to pass half a year abroad in St. Petersburg, so I picked up a bit of Russian. Then when I touched the end of my studies and had to choose a topic for my PhD, I chose to follow up on what I had seen in Ukraine and did do research on topic of national identity in Ukraine and how it materializes it in traditional music, in the use of traditional music. So that had me spend a couple of years with intense field research in Ukraine on the ground. And that was before I started then working for Goethe Institute in 2019 and getting the House of Europe in Ukraine, again, luckily for me, as the first assignment. So it's the same country and a very different job, but I'm very happy actually to be back again here in Ukraine.
Right. That leads us to today's topic, House of Europe. And I would like to start with a very basic but a very important question. What is actually House of Europe?
I guess there are two answers to this question. One is the more technical one. House of Europe is a EU-funded program, started last year, October 2019, has a budget of more than 12 million and is designed to last for 3 years. It's quite a complex program that is managed on behalf of EUNIC, the network of the EU cultural institutions active here in Ukraine, by a consortium of 4 institutions. I'm an employee of Goethe Institute. Goethe Institute has the lead in the implementation of the House of Europe, but works together in a consortium with the British Council, with the Institut Français, and with the Czech Center. And the program basically accompanies different reform sectors here in Ukraine, culture and creative industries being the most prominent one, but only 1 out of 6 reform sectors, by facilitating professional exchange and collaboration between Ukrainians and their counterparts in the EU. And as such, it has quite a broad portfolio of, we'll probably talk a little more about this, of more than 20 different program lines.
Right.
This is, if you want, so the more technical answer. The more metaphorical answer is, and this brings me back to the name of the program, House of Europe. So at the beginning, actually, there was the idea of having a House of Europe, a physical access point here in Kiev, where people could come get information on EU and EU programs that are open to Ukrainians. And actually, we still have this idea, and we will at some point have this physical access point here in Kiev. But at the same time, while the project was designed, we determined that even more important than having this house with walls and maybe with a flag hanging out is actually to create many spaces and also immaterial spaces for interaction between Ukrainians and EU counterparts. And that probably even more than in Kiev, we are needed elsewhere in the country, in the regions, in the provinces, where people have had much less chances to experience firsthand contact with their EU counterparts and the opportunities that the EU actually has open for Ukrainians already now. So this is why then beyond this Kiev access point, this Kiev hub, we also will have mobile structures traveling the country. We'll have a mobile pavilion that is designed to even reach out to very small places in the periphery of the country. We're collaborating, partnering up with existing cultural hubs in oblast centers. And also noteworthily, we will have an online hub, a virtual interaction place, a website that provides interaction and informs about the opportunities of the EU.
Right. So a house that is no house, at least for the time being, or I should rephrase it, a house that is so much more than a house, right? It's a very comprehensive program. It's a unique program. To my knowledge, the EU has never done anything like that before, not in this size, not outside the European Union. Why Ukraine? Why did the EU choose Ukraine for this important program?
I guess there are many good reasons for the EU to work with Ukraine. But I think the most obvious of those reasons is that Ukraine is the neighbor of the European Union. And even more, it's the biggest neighbor of the European Union. And so the EU is well advised to work closely with Ukraine. But more than that, there are, at least following the Maidan revolution, but probably even from beforehand, a couple of very interesting reform process ongoing in Ukraine for which the EU can lend support. And here maybe I should say that House of Europe is just one program by which the EU is giving this support to reform processes in Ukraine. And other than, for example, ministerial support that the EU is also providing, House of Europe is more sandwiched on this, on in between the level of ministries and the level of grassroots activists on the other hand. And is itself working more with a level of professionals, if you want, so those who are the implementers of those reform agenda. And then right. Specifically in the field of, if we're talking about the field of culture, then in Ukraine, what we are seeing is a very active, societally very conscious and relevant cultural scene and creative scene, creative entrepreneurial scene that absolutely deserves our support. And at the same time, that is also a source of inspiration and of fresh ideas for us from the perspective of the European Union. So I think this is a very important point, that House of Europe is not a one-way road. This really works in both ways.
Right. So it's cultural and creative exchange in the widest sense, which is a two-way street, not a one-way street. That leads me to the next question. What are the goals of House of Europe? I think it's important to underline that House of Europe is not a traditional support or AIDS program. It's not a charity, but it follows very precise goals. What are these goals? Very European goals, actually.
Yes, I guess they very much are. So as I said, we are not supporting the ministries directly. We're not so much focused on the activists. We are working with professionals in different reform sectors in Ukraine, culture and creative industries being the biggest one, education, health, media, social entrepreneurs, and people who are working with youth. Those are the 6 sectors that we have in our portfolio. And the goal is to enable exchange for those professionals with their counterparts in the EU, and also to enable cooperation, for example, cooperation projects between organizations from Ukraine and their counterparts in the EU. And that can take different forms. I mentioned we have more than 20 different program lines, but in principle, we have 2 different modi in which we are working. One is somebody has an idea. For example, a professional has the idea to travel to a conference in a new country that is relevant for his or her professional forthcoming, works out this idea, applies for a grant, convinces a jury, and as a result gets this grant, in that case a mobility grant, that supports the journey to this conference. It could be a cultural organization that wants to realize a co-production together with let's say a theater in the EU, again applies with this idea for an international cooperation project and receives funding. In that case, quite substantial funding, up to 50,000 euros per project. And like that, we have a number of program lines where we respond to ideas that others have. So we act as a donor.
Right.
To that, we are also having a couple of program lines where we have the idea and we work out this idea in detail. For example, we conceptualize a study tour. We had a study tour for museum managers to Germany. So our team actually curated a number of interesting best practices, case studies, interesting partner organizations in Germany, centered around the topic, in that case, of memory, culture, and local museums. And then we designed this program and then opened a call for museum managers from Ukraine to apply for this readily designed program, and then to travel to Germany with us and to use this as not only to get input from the German experts in that case, but also to develop their networks and then potentially also to build on those newly gained contacts in developing follow-up measures and even applying, for example, for other House of Europe program lines. So those program lines that we have, they are not isolated monoliths. You can imagine a curriculum through them. You could start, for example, with a relatively low threshold offer, like the study tour, where organization and the content is taken care of by us. That, by the way, also doesn't have a language barrier, because we also take care of the translation so that people can easily communicate with their counterparts in the target countries. And then based on this experiences, maybe you follow up on that with an individual mobility where you meet your potential partners and work out a project proposal with them. And then you can take this to the next level and apply for a bigger international cooperation project.
Right. I think that's one of the beautiful aspects of House of Europe. It's a dynamic thing. It's not cast in iron. You constantly develop actually new program lines, and you adjust. We'll talk about that in a second. You adjust to new situations, and as time has shown, you adjust very fast. But first, I would like to ask you, you know, House of Europe was launched last year, so it's still pretty new. It will run for a number of years. What is the initial feedback you're getting? How is House of Europe perceived in Ukraine? Do you get a lot of positive response?
We're quite happy with the resonance that we are getting. We're happy with the numbers of applications that we're getting. They vary, of course, throughout the program lines. Not all of the program lines are equally big in size, but if I shall give you a number to impress, then it would be the number of applications that we receive for infrastructure support that we're offering to small cultural organizations, specifically in the regions in the periphery of Ukraine. So we just had the second call for that and received quite a breathtaking number of 1,101 applications. So wow. This shows that we are obviously offering something that some people consider interesting and helpful, and obviously it's as you say, it's an ongoing process of adjusting those program lines, of reacting to newly emerging needs, and to also keep in mind how the program lines actually complement each other. But in general, and then there is a second side to this. On the one hand, we have our target groups, but on the other hand, we are also having the House of Europe as a role model for how the European Union designs its foreign cultural policy, and where House of Europe, if you want so, can be seen as a blueprint how intercultural exchange with neighboring countries can be designed, even in a delicate political constellation, as we undoubtedly have it with Ukraine, that is, geographically and in between Russia and the EU, and where there is significant political pressure on that EU neighbor on the part of Russia, and where and not just pressure on Ukraine, but also pressure on the European Union itself, and where now this project that actually allows a direct, personal, people-to-people contact between individuals from Ukraine and individuals from the European Union actually could be the best bet and the best guess that the EU can take in when confronted with fake news and all the big challenges.
Right. So it's very much not only about capacity building, but also about building European networks, in this case with Ukraine.
And truly European networks, in meaning that they can well reach beyond the territory of the European Union as such.
Christian, when you do a show like this in May 2020, it's almost impossible not to talk about COVID-19. For you, COVID-19 has also been a serious test. You started the program in fall last year, and then all sorts of program lines became available, and then COVID-19 hit Ukraine and also Europe, and that's of course important because all cross-border activities came to a halt. How did you experience COVID-19, and how have you adjusted to COVID-19?
Yeah, you're right. COVID-19 basically kicked in after we had just wrapped up our first half-year implementation cycle, first wave. The premiere of all the program lines, of most of the program lines, had happened. And when we just thought now we can smoothly and calmly start the second wave, that's exactly when COVID-19 hit us and forced us undoubtedly to revisit a number of program lines. I should say, reading a book in times of COVID-19 has not become wrong. So, for example, some program lines like our translation support basically continues as usual. But this is clearly the minority of cases. Everything else that is mobility related, and from what we've talked about so far, you see that this is quite a substantial part with study tours, with individual mobilities, with trans-border cooperation. Basically, House of Europe is about all those beautiful things, people to people working together with each other beyond borders, that now are not possible and that are now grounded and halted for the time being.
Right, so, but the plan is, if I understand correctly, to return to the original programs, which are transnational, trans-border programs with study tours, with exchanges of all sorts, as soon as possible.
Obviously, I think there is nothing that can really replace actual people meeting each other, getting the opportunity to travel to other countries to experience firsthand cultural differences and cultural commonalities, no doubt. But at the same time, TransCultural Exchange doesn't stop in the moment that people can, hopefully temporarily, not travel. So obviously we're also looking at all sorts of online formats in which we can enable the cultural exchange, and not just the cultural exchange, the other professional exchange in the other sectors as well. But I mean, more than that, this is really an extraordinary situation, especially in a country like Ukraine, and especially in the cultural sector in Ukraine that is obviously most vulnerable to a situation like COVID-19 and also the economic fallout that it has. And luckily, we as House of Europe are then also in a position where we can try and react in a way that can be meaningful, that can make a certain difference and maybe buffer some of the effects that the situation has. So very concretely, we were approached at an early stage, basically when the COVID-19 situation, when the quarantine measures were just looming. We were approached by the European Union delegation here in Ukraine and encouraged to react very quickly and very swiftly to the new situation, to reallocate a considerable amount of our budget for an immediate crisis response. So that partly consisted of redesigned, adjusted to the crisis program lines that we already had in our portfolio. I mentioned the infrastructure report. So this is one example where we took an existing program line and basically broadened it to the needs of cultural organizations in the acute crisis, where, for example, some organizations may be struggling in paying their rents, in paying their salaries, and now can get up to 9,000 euros support from House of Europe to get through this crisis.
Right. This is non-refundable grants.
I'm sorry?
It's non-refundable grants.
This is non-refundable grants, exactly. This is, I mean, you have to undergo an application, a procedure in which you also explain how you will make use of this money, obviously, and how you plan to sustain your activity, partly with the help of this grant through the crisis, maybe enable remote work, enable formats that are crisis compatible, etc. So it's kind of, you have to develop a sort of a survival strategy. But then House of Europe can kick in, hopefully quite unbureaucratically, in giving you the necessary funding for that. There is a similar but newly designed format that we developed, and that, by the way, is still open for applications and will stay open for a couple of more weeks. The online university, where we thought, well, cultural individuals that are now stripped of their commissions, performances, etc., they may have time for some online capacity building, for kind of using the involuntarily free time for online learning, and at the same time we could reward this. This could make them more stronger to outsmart the crisis, and we could kick in not just with curating a couple of such online courses for the culture and creative people in Ukraine, but also rewarding a successful participation in such a course with a small stipend of 3,000 hryvnias, roughly 100 euros. So this is another kind of small survival kit in which we try to bring together, making the best out of the situation in terms of capacity building and learning, and also enabling basically professional forthcoming on one hand, and smoothening existential needs on the other hand. And then maybe I should also mention, we don't know the answers to all challenges of the crisis, obviously. So since we don't, we also decided it's a good idea to just bring many people together and encourage them to develop, to partner up, to form new alliances, and to develop new ideas. What could be the solutions to this crisis? And this is what we did just 1 month ago. We actually got inspired by a format from the IT world, the hackathon. We're not the only ones to get inspired by this. There were a lot of hackathons held around Europe and around the globe in order to outsmart the crisis. But we basically took this format to the cultural sector, adjusted it, and basically brought together more than 1,000 people from the cultural field and the IT field, that then formed teams, and during 48 hours of intense work with the help of mentors also partly from the European Union, developed promising ideas, and this was a cooperation with the Goethe Institute, and in order to not leave it with a development of ideas, but also to help implementing them, it's again House of Europe's turn to support a couple of the top 20 of those ideas can now apply at House of Europe for follow-up grants, worth to 25,000 euros.
Yeah, fantastic. Christian, many people who watch this video will be practitioners. They will want to know under which conditions can they participate in one of the program lines. Is House of Europe open to individuals, to individual cultural managers, or even artists? Or do you have to be part of a larger organization to submit an application?
It depends on the program line which you're looking at. Definitely, House of Europe has a lot in store for individuals. I mentioned the study tours. Here, basically, you can take part if you have the relevant professional experience, no matter what your legal status is. For the programs where we give a grant to somebody, well, still our mobility grants, they are for individuals, but I mean, this is more on a technical note. In order to transfer this money to you and hold you basically accountable for your spending, we will need to contract a legal entity. So ideally, many cultural professionals have this status. You would be a private entrepreneur or have an organization, for example, your employer, the school where you're working, etc., that can receive and process this mobility grant on your behalf. When we talk about the larger project funding that House of Europe is giving, for example, translation grants, those we give to publishers. The publishers will be our contractual partners. If we talk about big international corporation grants worth up to 50,000 euros. So I think here it's clear that you need, in order to process such a substantial funding, you probably need some sort of an organizational infrastructure. And this is why those kind of grants are open only to cultural organizations in that case. But there is a number of more capacity building programs that are definitely open for individuals. We even have programs, program lines for university students. We have European youth camps for very young people, for whom this can be the first contact actually with European languages, with European approaches. So yeah, stay tuned, and hopefully we'll have something for you, no matter of your legal status.
Right. In any case, I think it's a good idea to check out the website of House of Europe, which we insert in the bottom of this screen, houseofeurope.org.ua. House of Europe is, of course, also very prominent on Facebook, with almost daily updates on their programs and new initiatives. Christian,
this is, sorry if I can interrupt you here. It's our mandate and it's our ambition not to inform only about our own program lines, but also to aggregate more and more other interesting opportunities that the EU offers to Ukrainians, not House of Europe, but other EU programs, and also that are, for example, in the EU member states, and that are open to Ukrainians. You will be astonished.
House of Europe, you also operate as a networker, not least.
Absolutely, we are definitely moving in this direction, assembling more and more.
Another question that frequently pops up when people talk about House of Europe, and many times people also approach me and ask me about information regarding House of Europe, is the question of language. You mentioned it briefly earlier. The concern here many times is, is it mandatory to speak English? And if so, do I have to speak fluent English, in order to be able to be admitted to the process, to be considered even? What is the situation?
Yes, language, of course, is key in the context of intercultural communication and cooperation. It's also for sure, it's no coincidence that the organizations behind House of Europe, the international cultural organizations, at the same time are also language schools. The Goethe Institute teaches, provides German courses, so does the British Council, and so forth, because there is a connection between understanding a language and coming to terms in the direction of cultural exchange and cultural cooperation. We try to keep the language barrier as low as possible, or we try to provide tools in order to surpass it. I mentioned that in many of our study tools, we actually have a translator on board so that we not exclude those who may not be as versed in English or other EU languages yet, which means that probably they need this experience even more than others because maybe they didn't have the opportunity to engage in intercultural exchange so far. With the mobilities, basically it's up to the applicant if an applicant can show us how they will realize their individual, for example, how they will take part in this conference, how they will do the internship at the hospital in Slovakia without knowing English or Slovakian. Yeah, maybe they know a colleague there that speaks Ukrainian. Maybe they think that, like in the case of Slavic languages, maybe even there is a level of understanding for Ukrainians and their neighboring countries. Maybe you don't know English, but you know Italian. So this is basically up to the applicant to explain to us how the language barrier will not be an issue in realizing. Local projects. There are natural limits. If we talk about two organizations realizing a big co-production with one another, probably the lingua franca will be English, and that's why for those program lines also we expect a project application even in English.
So language may not be so much of an issue for projects that take place only in Ukraine, but as a matter of fact, many of your program lines and projects are transnational, European, right, with study trips and so on and so forth. And then, of course, language is an important element because, after all, Europe is also about languages, correct?
It's about many languages, yes.
Yeah.
And sure, but I mean, to put it positively, this is also the contribution that we can make. I mean, so far, for many reasons, Ukraine is just opening up to the international connections in different realms, in different reform areas, in terms of political cooperation and in terms of cultural exchange. And this is a fascinating process that is taking part in Ukraine. And Ukraine has so much to offer. Again, this is not a one-way road. People in the EU know so little about what's actually going on, how many exciting things are going on in Ukraine.
Right.
But this is where we, as an international organization, as an international donor, and with the international culture institutes behind us, can actually kick in and this is also our difference point to other exciting cultural organizations in Ukraine that are supporting, for example, cultural fields. But they do this with probably a bit less of the international or transnational outlook and network that we can offer.
Right. House of Europe should not discourage, but be rather be an incentive for people, right, to engage in something that is very, very European. Now, say I'm somebody who is interested in one of the project lines, program lines that you're offering, and I decide I want to give it a shot. Want to participate. I want to submit an application. But I'm not sure how to do this application. Does House of Europe, does your team provide assistance for people who are interested?
We absolutely do. And there are different ways how to reach us. You can drop us an email. We have an email address, ask@houseofeurope.org.ua. You can call us. We have a wonderful front desk coordinator who will respond to your calls or redirect you to for example, the program managers that can of the different program lines that can answer specific questions. And we will shortly also have the physical access point in Kyiv, where you can actually come and visit us. And we don't stay in Kyiv. We already have in the preparation local spin-offs of the House of Europe, where we kind of take the House of Europe on the move and have a temporary show up.
Like road shows, basically.
Exactly, shorter and longer stays in bigger and smaller cities in the periphery, where again, interested applicants are most welcome to come and get information and get counseling.
All right. Well, Christian, you and your team have been doing fantastic work. I may say that because I follow things quite closely. Most people here know you, of course, as Christian Diemer, head of or team lead of House of Europe. What not so many people know is the other Christian Diemer, the serious musician, the composer. You are only in your mid-30s. You've already written an opera. You have written several pieces for large orchestra. You have written chamber music, and so on and so forth. I mean, that is really remarkable. Now, my question is, you are holding a position, you're doing a job that obviously keeps you very, very busy. Do you still find time for music, or how does a person who is obviously so creative channel his creativity?
But House of Europe is a very creative task as well. I mean, I certainly don't feel bored just because for the moment I'm not or less composing. But I mean, jokes aside, for sure, managing a project of this size with a 12 million budget, being responsible for a team of, I mean, we are almost 30 people in the centralized team, plus the consortium, the partner teams. So with the support of the team, this is definitely quite a job, and that keeps me quite busy. But I think there is also a beauty in a way, taking the experiences that I have as a practitioner and using them in some ways while I'm now on the other side, as in the position of shaping support and capacity building for artists, for cultural managers, for cultural curators, which are things that I love, that I'm passionate about, that I have been working and am still working on. But at the same time, being in this position as House of Europe actually opens up quite a lot of possibilities to also have an impact that is certainly just about as meaningful as, for example, the impact that you have when you're writing an opera.
Right, but the music is still there, still in your head.
So the music didn't stop playing. Well,
right. That's what I guessed.
But the tune that House of Europe is humming is quite a nice tune as well, I must say.
Right, and being the conductor of this team of 27 people that you are now is, I guess, also often fun.
It's just as good as orchestra pieces. Yes, it is.
Wonderful. Look, you by all standards, you're still young. You know, yet when you look at your bio, you know, it's so impressive. You've done so many things in your life already. Do you have a plan for your own future? Do you have goals in your life, or are you somebody who says, "Okay, I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I just go with the flow"?
Well, I may go with the flow, but at the moment, there is a certain line drawn ahead of me. House of Europe shall continue for at least another 3 years. So hopefully I will have the opportunity to stay here in Ukraine and continue working on this wonderful project, which I really enjoy. I mentioned that I'm an employee of Goethe Institute, so this would probably see me switching countries at some point. The Goethe Institute assignment is one that involves rotation through different countries. So I can think of many other exciting places where I may be happy in the future. But for now, to be honest, I'm quite happy right here where I am in Kiev, in Ukraine, and as part of House of Europe, in the middle of the House of Europe team. So yeah, if you want so, I'm quite going with the flow at the moment.
Right. And you're in the flow, right? And you and your team are in the flow.
We are all very much in the flow. Yes.
Yes. Christian, thank you so much. We are running out of time. Thank you so much for being our guest. In fact, our first guest at this first edition of the Austrian KulturCafé. It was a true pleasure having you and talking to you. This brings us to the end of today's show. On behalf of the entire team, I would like to say thank you for joining us. Please stay tuned for the next edition of the KulturCafé. From me, it's Servus and good evening from Kiev.